Recently, we commissioned, or I guess had commissioned, a life cycle analysis of our product, trying to get down to the units to understand what really is our potential for impact here, as we're understanding that huge number, especially in terms of like global impact. And we were able to use a framework that gets down to the product environmental footprint. So that takes into account carbon emissions, water, land use. There's a climate change impact score, resource depletion. And we found that our product by unit was 93% lower than existing polyester. So the opportunity for impact is huge. And I think that's where the optimism comes in, is that 10% is a really big percentage of global impact.
Hardware to Save a Planet explores the technical innovations that are giving us hope in the fight against climate change. Each episode focuses on a specific climate challenge and explores an emerging physical technology solution with the person bringing it into reality. I'm your host, Dylan Garrett. Hardware to Save a Planet is brought to you by Synapse. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to Hardware to Save a Planet. I'm here today with Zahlen, Titcomb, and Kristen Albrecht, the co-founders of Ravel. We'll be talking about making the fashion industry more sustainable. I'll be honest that my first reaction when I heard about this was to question how big of a problem textiles could really be in the scheme of things. But it turns out the fashion industry generates 97 million tons of waste annually and is responsible for something like 10% of global emissions. Also 20% of global clean water pollution. So it is in fact a big deal. Less than 1% of textiles are recycled into new clothing. Most ends up incinerated or in landfills. And a big part of the problem is polyester, the material that helps make our clothes less expensive, quick drying, and wrinkle-free. But it's energy intensive to produce and difficult to recycle. Ravel has developed a way to recycle polyester that they say is a light touch, energy efficient, closed loop process. The resulting product consumes 59% less energy, reduces CO2 emissions by 32%, and saves up to 90% of the water compared to virgin polyester, and costs about the same. In a world where we're producing more and more clothing every year, making this industry more circular feels really important. Zahlen is entrepreneurial and knows the textiles industry really well. Prior to starting Ravel in 2019, he co-founded multiple companies, including the leading Ultimate Frisbee apparel brand, 5 Ultimate, and also BAM Boxers, which had the mission to bring people the most comfortable underwear ever using responsible bamboo fabrics. I'm excited to hear how those experiences led to Ravel. And Kristen is a late joining guest here, so really excited to have you too, Kristen, and I'll let you introduce yourself, but thanks a lot for joining us.
Awesome. I come from an apparel background. Prior to this, I was in supply chain design. I had my own apparel company where I was making a lot of polyester, elastane, blended materials. And I was working with a lot of the big recyclers to find solutions for end of life for my products. And that was the beginning of the journey for the lack of the solution in the industry. I was really frustrated by the solutions I was given. And as a small business, when you're trying to create a product that has a big solution and you're not treated with much weight in the industry. So I was given a bad product that was a byproduct of existing recycling infrastructure, and that made it really hard to just exist. So I started looking for what solutions were out there. I got my MBA in sustainable solutions and was connected with Zahlen and a handful of other folks in Seattle who were all fighting for the same solution. So we started with the problem and we created really clear design principles of really what had to exist for this to work for where each of us were coming from in our industries. And from there, Ravel was born. So yeah, here we are today. I lead operations and sustainability at Ravel, and I'm excited to dive in.
Nice. I love that. I definitely see companies both starting with a solution or starting with a problem and finding a solution. But I think both are valid, but I'm excited to hear how you guys arrived at the solution you're focused on now. Maybe just to rewind a little bit, because Zahlen, I think this is really interesting. I have I have this vague memory of meeting either you or one of your siblings in Seattle wearing some 5 Ultimate apparel, and it must have been around like 2007 or 2008, something like that. And I hadn't put 2 and 2 together until I started sort of snooping about you online today before recording this. But I'm really curious to hear that story a bit, just because I think it's pretty interesting and how that led to what you're doing today.
Yeah. We are, my siblings and I are all ultimate Frisbee players. And so a long time ago, we were very infatuated by the sport, still are, let's be fair. And the lack of I'm seeing the parallel just now, the lack of a solution in the space for what we wanted as players. Like, so we went out and created our own product line, our own ultimate Frisbee apparel line. And I was living in China doing finance and some consulting. And was making my dress shirts and suits on my own and with tailors. And I was trying to skip some middle people. And I went down to the fabric markets and I'm like, wait, we can make Frisbee jerseys. Why not do that? So I ripped my tie off and quit the finance world. And we started 5 Ultimate, which is ended up being the biggest Ultimate Frisbee apparel player in the space. And it was based around this idea of like, let's give Ultimate players an identity. Therefore, if I'm running into anyone on the street who's got a 5 shorts or shirt on, like there's like, oh, you play Ultimate too. That's a funky bunch. Let's not pretend it's football or a mainstream sport or whatnot. But it comes with a certain set of principles to the sport that we all believed in growing up. And so that was a good 15 years of our lives building that business, and I spent about 10 of it on boots on the ground, running the materials design and supply chain for all of these blended material fabrics that make clothing awesome, right? Polyester elastane, to Kristen's point too. Like, it's what makes clothing really like fun to wear. And you could ask anyone who is a yoga practitioner to try and do a session without elastane in their yoga pants. That's not going to go very well. It's one of those things that sort of finds its way into most of the products we wear. And it was a great product for us and Ultimate players who are very active, very athletic. So that's kind of got my interest peaked as we were getting towards the end of selling that business eventually. What's going to happen to all this stuff after we're done? There's no end. There was no end of life. There was sustainable manufacturing and best practices, but there wasn't a lot of chatter back then about what do you do? What's circular economy? What's the end of life of materials, at least in the common space. And Frisbee pretends like it's a little bit ahead of the game sometimes, even though it's just its own little niche. But it did open up a very, very crystal clear picture into the problem. To Kristen's point. And as creators and as innovators and entrepreneurs, there's a mindset that's like, oh, there's a problem. Like, let's find the solution for that problem. And so starting with those core design principles around like what needs to be true for this to actually solve the problem. That those waste numbers that you tossed out there, there's hundreds of other data points that you can rattle off that just make it a pretty dark and grim place. So there's a balance. You have to live in a balance of optimism and pessimism when you're facing this. But if you come at it like, let's solve this, roll up the sleeves and get it done. It was my time making stuff that sort of peppered the very beginnings of the future of like, how can we unmake it? I don't know if that works, but we're going to go with it.
And when we're talking about waste, and the problem, I guess, just generally, should I be thinking about literally like the clothing that people are wearing and the end of life of that clothing, or are we mostly talking about waste that's coming from the sort of industrial production process, like coming out of textile factories, like the cutting floor kind of waste?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways to call these things out, but the way we typically split them up, and I'll talk about one of them and I'll have Kristen talk about the second, but it's post-industrial waste and post-consumer waste. Post-industrial waste would be the typical stuff that comes in the supply chain. Like when you're cutting a t-shirt, you cut the neckline out of the t-shirt. That piece of fabric you've cut out is not really useful for much else. Likewise, if you make a bulk run of yarn or a fabric that doesn't dye quite right to the exact color black that someone wanted, like that ends up being waste in the system. And there's most industries have a percentage waste that happens at the various tiers of supply chain. And that's one of the places where we can operate as Ravel, is in that waste stream. And uniquely so, because a lot of those waste streams are blended materials. And so one of our value propositions and one of our design principles, like we have to be able to meet waste where it is and talk about what it is. And the expanse of our technology is focused on polyester and polyester elastane, but it's also capable of other fiber blends as well, including nylon and cotton. We'll just hint at that a little bit, not talk too deeply about it, but it's on our roadmap, and be excited to be able to talk more about that soon, given certain circumstances. But the whole other side of the picture is post-consumer waste, and that's the one that we all touch. That's our closet version. Kristen has a little bit more experience, most recently working in some of that supply chain and building those partnerships to talk to some of the idiosyncrasies there. It's massive.
Yeah. I think that's one of the scary things about thinking about waste is how many stages there are in creating a product and that there's waste at every stage. So like Zahlen says, it starts in that post-industrial world of, you know, fiber, yarn, textile, cut and sew, garment. But then, yeah, we get past that post-industrial into the pre-consumer, which are the garments that have been made and get rejected. I'm sure you've seen the headlines of companies. Fashion is very secretive. And so when you make a product, if there's a reason you can't sell it, you don't want that to go into the secondhand market. So then that all, right now gets landfilled and incinerated. And so that's a huge sector of materials to be recycled. And then we get into post-consumer, and that is just the unfathomable amount of apparel that we really can't even get a grasp on the quantities of it yet because of the waste streams that exist and how the trading routes currently go of from garment material waste throughout our world and typically shipped down to the global south to be ignored and really not quantified.
And is there, when we think about, I don't know if the 97 97 million tons, does that kind of include all this sort of post-industrial, pre-consumer and post-consumer waste, and is one bucket of that dominating the others?
It primarily focuses on post-consumer, but it does have some post-industrial in there. And again, I think what we're learning is that there are so many waste streams that are not accounted for in that number, and so it's really a bit terrifying of how much waste it really is.
And then when we think about the number I saw was 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions attributed to the fashion industry. What's driving that primarily? And given that you're focused on, at least initially, polyester, recycling polyester, how big of the total problem is that?
From an industry standpoint, I think it's just, when we think about buying a t-shirt, let's just use that as a simple example. It's a one transaction. We're buying a t-shirt from a retailer. It's like, oh, it's just one product. But the supply chain that's behind that is very long and very linear. And I'll give one sort of acute example, and that is that because margins are so squished, because consumers have become so accustomed to low cost clothing, there's very little room in most of that long linear supply chain for innovation, for any environmental concern. And there's a lot of incentive, unfortunately, to cut corners on things that might not show up in the final product until the fourth wash or the fifth wash. So when we talk about where those impacts are coming from, some of them are measured and some of them are not captured. And there is not currently a very powerful system in place to merit or to reward anything other than a market-based approach to trying to enact change in this industry. It's also pretty fragmented in that there are a lot of brands and a lot of clothing manufacturers and a lot of fabrics and a lot of fabric manufacturers. And a lot of it happens across all different places in the world. It's a very global linear economy. And so if you start to add up all those small pieces, there's a leak in every single step. And it can come from as simple to go back to my China days, it can come from as simple as like literally the ironing in the factory to make the clothes look prettier as they go off the door is run by a dirty coal chimney in the yard, right? It's just because that's the cheapest way to make steam. And sure, we actually paid the factory to install an electric steam generator, to improve just the simple smoke coming off of the plot of land that we were manufacturing some of our clothes on. We didn't own the factory. Had no reason to do this. We just this is something we want to do. But there, without us, there was no incentive to not just plume the black smoke up to make the shirt pretty so that the person can enjoy exactly how they wanted it as it came off the shelf. End of life. That's some sort of subjective commentary there. Kristen has a little bit more of a deeper background on some of the impact metrics, and so she might have something nice to add there.
Yeah, I think that what I really appreciate about what you said is that it's a lot about speed and money as to why these, numbers get hiked up so high. Recently, we commissioned, or I guess had commissioned, a life cycle analysis of our product, trying to get down to the units to understand what really is our potential for impact here as we're understanding that huge number, especially in terms of like global impact. And we were able to use a framework that gets down to the product environmental footprint. So that takes into account carbon emissions, water, land use. There's a climate change impact score, resource depletion. And we found that our product by unit was 93% lower than existing polyester. So the opportunity for impact is huge. And I think that's where the optimism comes in, is that 10% is a really big percentage of global impact. But if you think of these numbers, 93%, then the potential for really having a huge impact on that global quantity, those emissions, that's where the optimism comes for me.
Yeah. Maybe it's a bit of a tangent, but it feels like so much of the challenge as you're describing it is driven by, sort of consumer behavior and fast, this like fast fashion trend and all of this. Like, is there another way to come at this problem that changes that behavior that's kind of driving so much of these challenges in the first place?
Yeah, totally there is. That will be a little bit academic and nerdy and talk about systems level approach, or maybe we won't. We'll just talk about like, okay, the market's working the way it is. We are making decisions the way we are. I think one of the biggest challenges is that climate startups are sometimes faced with is that those are the rules that we're working by, the current system we're working in. And the kicker, the nugget, the thing we're all digging for is like, how can we use those rules and use that system to create something better, bigger, and replace the antiquated systems that sort of put us where we are right now, right? And so we can't just go out and say nobody buy stuff. We can go out and say, hey, here's a product that is drop-in ready, same cost, and you, manufacturer, you don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but you could. Right. And if you do, guess who's going to come knocking is all those other customers of yours that would rather be manufacturing with something better than the alternative. They would rather see that 93% impact savings on their report. And guess what? It's not going to cost you more. So what you end up with is this interesting scenario where we can we could stop the fight between the chief sustainability officer and the chief financial officer, who always get their dukes up about like, oh, but we should be doing this. And like, we know this is right. And the CFO usually believes it and understands it, but my hands are tied. I can't give you another penny for this. Well, guess what? It's got to be a market-based solution. And I think that's what I think is common in a lot of some of the peers that we see, and at least the people that we look up to in the industry. They've figured out how to go to market with a solution that is market-based, that understands what the problem is, and that is not trying to stop us from buying clothing or not put a last stain in something, as example. There a lot of different people are going to succeed in this. We just hope, or we believe that if Ravel can be the one that can be the market-based approach, that's going to make a big change. That's the optimism that Kristen is mentioning there.
Right, but because you're at price parity, you don't you're not depending on kind of altruism or sustainability motivations to succeed.
Yeah. Well, and here's the kicker, Dylan. Like, you don't have to depend on altruism to make these things change, but you still get to make people feel good about themselves. You still get to change their mindset about what they're wearing. I mean, when we go out to let's say a Seattle sports event, it could be any of them. Typically, we're going to pick a color that represents how we feel about the team, right? that's a part of our identity. When we show up in the world, we choose what we wear. Now, imagining yourself in a scenario where you actually also get to choose what you wear being made out of something without any compromises to your purchasing habits, made out of something that was made from old clothing instead of from extracted fossil fuel resources, or, depleting land that is using all that water you quoted earlier for some like less than sustainable cotton practices. There's good and there's bad versions of all of it. But if your shirt was made from an old shirt, that says something about your identity. That's a mindset shift. And that doesn't need to be altruism. That can be just market-based. Let's just change the way people think about clothing and consumption in general through their identity and what they choose to wear, what they can choose to wear. That gets me, if it's not apparent in my tone of voice, that gets me fired up.
Yeah, totally. No, it's really exciting. So how did you, identifying the problem, what was the process of coming up with the solution you have? Because it sounds like it's a pretty big improvement over what else is out there. I've read a little bit about like chemical recycling and other methods for doing this that are more energy intensive and don't reach that cost parity that kind of drives the potential you're talking about. What was your approach to actually finding your solution?
Yeah, there were, I think there are some fundamental design principles that we started with, and that's a little bit the way we talk about it. And at a really high level, it comes down to making sure that we're not, well, let me back up. There are a couple fundamental design principles that we started with at the beginning. And the primary one from a technology perspective is to not destroy anything. We as humans have gone to a lot of work over many, many years to do a really good job of creating and building and making really cool stuff. And if we can maintain the value that's stored up in a material, such as a polyester, a bunch of monomers stuck together into a polymer, or a polyurethane, or a cellulose or cellulosic, or any other raw material, if we can maintain the value that's already been put into those and instead focus on enabling it for recycling and cleaning out and purifying all the other gunk that's in there that gets in the way, then that is intrinsically, we believed at the beginning, that should be the way that it should be done. And so that led us to along the path of the inventions that Ravel has come to through this to develop the IP around specifically a non-destructive approach to blended fiber materials recycling that maintains the value that's already been created in the world. Entropy does its thing. Entropy is there. Let's not forget about that, but let's not serve it up on a platter to just obliterate everything and break it all down and then have to sift through the soup and then build it back up again. Lower cost basis because it's slightly simpler. Lower energy use also contributes to lower cost basis, and those two together with a lower impact make for a very scalable product. And that's why when we first started out, was like, this is how we're going to go about this, because this needs to be able to scale. This needs to be able to go big, and it needs to be able to address a market that is currently already kind of strapped on the margin side of things.
I would just add that I think starting with the design principles, like Zahlen said, was really important. But one of Zahlen's superpowers is bringing the right people into the room at the right time. I think you can have ideas all you want, and you can have a problem and know there needs to be a solution. But Zahlen has this ability to bring people into a room together and almost like throw the question into the middle of the room, and then you just see the energy happen and the solutions come together. So a lot of it was right people in the right room with the right questions. And the guidelines were there. And from there it was, really fortunate to come up with a solution that abides by the design principles. But there was that line that if it doesn't abide by these, we're not moving forward. And so it did take years of working on this, but I just thought calling that out was an important part of our process.
No, I'm glad you said that, because that was going to be my next question. Is it feels like there must have been people on the team, and maybe it's you two, that had enough of experience in material science or chemistry or something to kind of understand how to take those design principles and navigate to a solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have some specific expertise on the team, but what I think is interesting, and I think advantage of ours is that we're not, we don't come from a round peg, round hole background. So when we are trying to solve a problem, if it's a chemistry problem, guess who's in the room? The engineering team too. If it's an engineering problem, guess who's in the room? The business team, the customer team. It's a group effort, and I think that's one of the ways that I like to see a business shine is when you can lean on instincts and insights that come from outside, maybe a realm of expertise. That's not to say that you don't need a couple PhDs. Don't get me wrong. We have a couple of those in our court. But I'll also maybe I could also use this moment to do a little bit of a shout out to some of your former Synapse crew who, in exchange for some beverages and snacks, definitely heard me rant and rave about some of the things we were excited about, and helped refine some questions here and there on a specific challenge or a specific problem over the years. Because it's a chemistry challenge, it's a materials challenge, it's also an engineering challenge. It is something that requires more than just a reaction, right? It's not something that happens just in a beaker. It's a solution that's an entire industry that uses all sorts of pipes and tubes and utilities and all these kind of things that actually make stuff. And so it's valuable to have some of the right people in the room at the right time to make sure you're capturing the right perspectives, and even the sometimes can be called weak signals that end up sort of being you know when a weak signal takes hold in your head. You know when it's going to be like, okay, I got to look into this because there's a thing here. And that's one of my favorite things is to have a chat with somebody who you're not necessarily expecting to get an expert answer out of, but you get an answer that ends up being more valuable than any expert could ever give you.
I know the process is proprietary. How much can you tell me about, what's happening? You're starting with blended fabrics, so you have a blend of polyester and other maybe natural fibers and whatnot. What are you doing? What are you doing? Can you talk about the steps in the process, or what can you say about what's happening?
Yeah, there's unfortunately not much I can tell as far as the juicy details, but I can help frame it up a little bit. And I think that ends up being kind of fun. And for anyone who is listening out there, this is maybe your Sunday crossword puzzle or something. We are we call it purification recycling, right? And I think that's what specifically differentiates it from what most people bucket recycling into, which is two categories: mechanical and chemical. And mechanical recycling is a lot more about taking a product and mashing it up and turning it into something else, ideally without degrading it as much as possible. Most mechanical recycling is actually downcycling. Semantics, pick your words, but that's the way we typically think about it, because it's using something that turns into something lower. I'm not talking about upcycling a t-shirt into a quilt or anything like that. Sort of a different world in the reuse repair economy. On the flip side of things, we have depolymerization in the polyester world, and that is very much what chemical recycling is. And that the fundamental principle there is to take the polymers that you have in place and break them all up and chop them all down into their fundamental building blocks, into their monomers. And then you can build those monomers back up. And that's what the oil and gas industry does with plastics, is takes those monomers and builds them back up into your polymers to then serve a certain purpose with a certain functionality. What Ravel rather focuses on is non-destructive, so not depolymerization, and preservation of the value that's been created, so not mechanical downcycling. And so what you end up instead is by taking textile inputs from blended materials and partitioning off the pieces that are in that mix or that blend of materials and getting them into single streams without destroying them. And so in that case, preparing them to be fed right back into the supply chain that original raw material needs to go into to make another shirt, if we go back to that example. So that's about as detailed as I'm willing to go at this point. It's, if you squint at it from a distance, it kind of looks like a Georgetown Brewing or something like that. It's pipes and tubes and tanks and and heat and vents and all this kind of good fun stuff. So it's very it's fun. And it involves chemical engineering, and it involves chemistry and engineering and mechanics and conveyance and all sort of interesting and elegant ways to process materials. We just figured out a really, really well adapted way to do that, to solve this at an economically advantaged way for textiles.
Mm. And at the beginning of the black, or before the black box, you have fabric that's blended, multiple materials. And at the end, if I understand right, you have polyester kind of pellets that can go back into polyester fabric production process, or polyester, I don't know if you call it yarn or whatever it is. Is that right?
Yep.
That's the way that the fundamental material flow diagram would see those materials coming in the door, and we would do our right sizing to get them in the right form factor to get into our system. And then the end product that ends up getting delivered to the customer is through the apparel supply chain, which starts with a polyester pellet, whether you would get it from a downcycled plastic bottle for what typically is called rPET today, recycled polyester, downcycled from the bottle flake world, or a virgin polyester pellet that would be specifically made and designed and also altered in order to be able to make it functional for textile polyester.
Okay. And where are you in development now? What kind of maturity is your process in? Are you doing this for customers today? What does that look like?
Yeah, right. In the context of hardware, I'll use my brewery example here. You could think of us as a microbrewery. We've built a pilot plant in Sodo, just south of downtown Seattle. And its design capacity is in the tonnage range. And so it's enough to hit minimum order quantities of thousands of kilos of material for customers to be able to take a industrial scale product through their entire supply chain and make an actual t-shirt that someone can actually wear. So there are not a lot of pre-seed companies that have done that. It was a decision that we made early on to just make stuff, just make stuff, make it, and we'll show them that this works, and it works. And so now we're in the process of showing them that it works. And for a lot of if you could imagine, the textile industry is very tactile, right? You want someone to be comfortable. And so unfortunately, a lot of the subjective testing that has to happen in the world of clothing does play out in how does the fabric feel? How does it work? How does a brand like one that Kristen ran or one that I ran actually engage and interact with this material? And so when we produce a pellet that it'll end up going through the supply chains of these various customers and partners, we have a handful of them that we're working with. Not really any that we can throw out there on the internet like this, but some of the world's most iconic outdoor apparel brands, some of the largest global fashion houses globally, some of the biggest, massive manufacturing group in Central America. When you have a product that doesn't cost any more than anyone else's, it's pretty easy to get in their first door. That the work that Kristen's been doing a really great job on in the commercialization side of things is finding those right partners who want to be first to market with this. So the line's around the block, and now it's a matter of putting more capacity in the pilot plant to be able to show it, like kind of told you so a little bit, is to be cheeky about it. But Kristen, engaging with customers has been fun for sure.
Yeah, I believe that's coming from apparel is part of the reason why we are where we are right now, which is, like Zahlen said, there's so much in apparel that goes beyond a spec sheet or any sort of data that you can provide. It's an action, it's a trial, it's physically running something, producing it. So we knew that we needed to get product in hand to make the sale, because I could send you a spec sheet all day long that we're going to make this at these exact specs for you on this date. But until like the deep supply chain folks get that product in hand and say, sure, it's what you said it was, but can it run smoothly? Is it strong enough to knit? Is it strong? There's all these different things that there's no spec to it. It's action. It's just getting it in there on the machines. So creating this pilot unlocks our ability to do that, to know that it's so much more than just the data of the product. It's the trust of the folks that run these machines. And if they say to the next person in their supply chain, yes, this runs, then they'll try it and they'll run it. And so much more of a handshake and industry than, you'd want it to be sometimes, but knowing that gave us that leg up to get the product in their hands, and now we're running those trials.
I see. Otherwise, you may not have prioritized actually making something and actually providing the material to your
Yeah, this is
customer as
certainly
early as you
not
did.
the most financially efficient, way on paper to get there, but we knew that we had to get buy-in from supply chain, and so we prioritized building a plant this early in our stage.
And that and that's what unlocks Dylan the big why and the big solution and the big win here. If we can get supply chain on board, I don't want to say the rest is easy because it's all hard. But once you get the supply chain on board, it's a piece of cake to go over to Nike or Adidas or Lululemon and be like, hey, your yarn manufacturer uses our stuff. Do you want to use our stuff? And then they can go do capsule collections to Kingdom Come and all sorts of things, whatever they want for marketing. We just know that since supply chain's on board, it'll run. And it's not like a one-off, and doesn't die in trial phase. It doesn't die in capsule collections or whatnot. So it's a short-term expense and a long-term win is basically the way we went at it. And we're lucky to have some fantastic investors on board who have sort of feel the same way as we do. And I think that's showing itself, is paying off already.
So that I don't know this industry super well, but is that how it works? Your customers are the yarn manufacturers who then supply to the brands that we all know and wear.
Yeah. So we will be selling our first go-to-market product is a polyester pellet. So we will be feeding that right into the supply chain to be made into yarn. Up the supply chain it goes. And different brands have different ownership structures. Some brands only buy finished product. Some brands do own some sectors of manufacturing. So there's also that element that there's not one model. There are many, levels of vertical integration from manufacturers to brands. And so it's also finding those right partners at your right stage who, you might want it to be vertically integrated so you can get that full product made in-house, because it has to go from fiber to yarn, and up. So there's all sorts of options for how you can be successful.
And then on the other side, where your suppliers, your feedstock is this waste product, what does that process look like? And is there a challenge there to acquiring enough of this? Is that a big component of, we talk about reaching cost parity. Is that a big component of that's driving your cost, or is it free because it's a waste? What is that?
Yeah. If we go back to that original design principles piece of wanting to design for blended materials, it turns out no one else really wants the blended materials. So one of the advantages of being flexible to our feedstock means that we are able to take, and actually we even prefer to take in some cases, the polyester elastane blends, because no one else can recycle elastane the way that we can. No one else can take that high level of yoga pant stretch that is just going to landfill or burned, or depending on what country or region you're in, there's different regulations on how that's handled. And it's not always to particularly high standards. So being able to walk in and I don't want to say have the pick of the crop, but being flexible on feedstock is it's a breath. You can see the breath of relief when you're talking to some of these supply chain partners. Holy moly. They're like, oh, okay, thank you. You mean I don't have to sort everything like one lot, this to this to this to this? No, okay. We could take the blends. Oh, let's do it. So that's an entry in the door from the feedstock perspective. And when we start talking about what we typically refer to as the big four, which is polyester, cotton, nylon, elastane. Those are the 85% of all textile fibers, are those four. And so that makes up most of what our closets are. Our most iconic piece might be a leather jacket. It might be a wool sweater, because maybe it stands out, but pretty much everything that everybody wears is those four primary fiber types. And our technology applies to those four. The go-to-market version being poly and polyelastane as a feedstock, but we could take the rest of it too. And so you don't get stuck in this world where you have to have a very specific, pure, bespoke feedstock source to be able to operate. And that's where we're very excited to start to work with and find more folks that kind of understand the value that sort of brings to the industry. Because we're not just talking about recycling the top of the pyramid, the top of the waste pyramid, the pure materials. We're starting from the bottom here. That's the big win. That's really exciting. Not just to brands, not to us and our investors, but to municipalities, to humans, to that 10% number that you're quoting. That's the bottom of the waste pyramid. That's where it really gets exciting to be able to tackle that.
Because this stuff would otherwise be going essentially to landfills.
It can be very opaque.
Waste markets they do have value. And so we do model at purchasing feedstock, because the thing is, like, we have a dual commercialization approach because it's a two-product system. We have something coming in and many things going out. So those supply chains both have to be managed. And I think that's where it comes in, thinking intentionally about partners, because those vertically integrated systems, there's waste at every stage. And so if you're integrating into one of those that is a unit, you have opportunity for negotiating what's coming into what's going out, because it's part of the same system. And I think that while the industry progresses, right now there are not clear parameters for what recyclers need. So what we call pre-processing is the waste before it gets to us. That's a real growing industry. So hopefully over time we will, be paying a better price for feedstock, because it'll be more uniform, more quality assured, and we'll actually know what we're receiving.
I imagine this is an industry with some really well-established incumbents that you're now kind of competing with. How do they view what you're doing? I mean, I imagine you're still, very small relative to them. But is your strategy to work with these incumbents or compete with them directly?
The big wide world of textiles and textile recycling is big and wide. And so I think there's a room for a lot of wins. I think there's a room for a lot of our fellow innovators to get traction. And we believe we have, to be a little bit bold about it, one of, if not the best technology to recycle textiles. But that does mean that the entire system needs to work together for that to come to fruition. We can beat our chest about that as much as we want, but it's not going to happen unless we're working with other folks. And so collaboration and cooperation is part of the way this ends up playing out, honestly. And the incumbents, the big incumbents, the ones who have all the money, actually have a pretty good view from the top of their big piles of money, if I can be a little cheeky there, of what the future looks like. And I think they do see and they do acknowledge and recognize that there is going to be a shift, or there should be a shift towards a more of a mindful use of materials in the circular economy model and a recycling model and end of life treatment of stuff. So I would to pick between the two of collaboration and not. I would pick. We're going to be planning on collaborating with people as much as possible, because I think that's how the rising tide lifts everyone in this.
Looking into the future a bit, I don't know if the right number to kind of grok the scale of the challenge or the opportunity for you is this 97 million tons or 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. But what are your ambitions for Ravel and the potential you have for impact relative to the total problem here?
A couple of different ways to answer it. I want to see everyone I walk down the street and run into. I would love to see them embodying circular economy materials through their t-shirts. That would be huge, right? And bonus, if they don't even know it, right? If they think they're just getting a t-shirt and it's the status quo and it's normal to just be wearing something that comes from responsible stewardship of the materials, that would be huge. From an actual volume perspective, we're shooting for lots and lots and lots and lots of tons, right? It's the way that the size of the polyester market alone means that we could be gangbusters to the moon and still be just a fraction of the big market. Not a drop in the bucket, but a cup of the bucket, right? In that sense, because of our price parity approach, it's not a demand-driven challenge. It's an execution and deployment-driven challenge. And so where do we want to be? It's not about how much, it's about how fast we can get there. So when we talk about our goals, it's a little bit more around velocity at this point than total throughput, knowing that we're nowhere near the top of where we'll end up. It is just, the potential is so massive, Dylan, especially when you start to break into the post-consumer world. It's insane. And so we just want to get there as quickly as possible with what we have, because we think it's the right way to do it.
I have 3 last questions for you. I'll divvy these up between you. The first for you, Kristen, is how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future of the planet and why?
It's surprisingly hard to answer, but I'd say cautiously optimistic. Being in the textile industry and specifically in recycling, we see so many innovators really tackling these huge challenges. And we also see brands, manufacturers, supply chain really willing to adopt these solutions. And so I think when I look at that, I see it makes me really optimistic. There's this excitement for change, which I think is rare in such an old industry. When I think of like the scale of the climate crisis, like I guess that's where my cautious kind of a little hesitant side comes in, is because it's so large, it's so vast, and that can be really intimidating. But I think I take a step back, I take a step down, I look at more of my daily interactions, and I see change really coming, and I see adoption, not just on the future, but really an active choice. So I feel so proud of what we're doing at Ravel. It being a systems approach change where you have an innovation and that meets direct supply chain alignment, that makes me really optimistic.
All right, love to hear it. Zahlen, who is another company or individual doing something to address climate change that's inspiring you?
For that, I think I'd like to call out one of our early investors, which is At One Ventures, and I think this is where you end up with a specific human that sees a version of the future that they want to see come to fruition. And one of the partners of At One, this guy Tom Chi, if you have ever come across any of his teachings, he thinks about the world in I'm going to get it wrong, but it's like 1 minute, 1 day, and 10,000 year increments. That's how he lives his life. And to have that mentality and conviction from an investor out there in the world pushing companies to succeed and change things in the view of climate in a market-based solution has been just fantastic. They're great. They've been very supportive as an investor, of course, too. But if you have people out there deploying capital in places where they're pretty sure they understand how it's going to work, it's refreshing. It's very refreshing because they've done it before, and they kind of Tom is a savant in some senses, knows how the world works, and it's cool to get his take on things. Even just for a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, it's a good guy to hang out with.
Yeah, totally. I did an episode with him, and I.
Oh, no way! Of course.
I cherish every time I get a chance to talk with him or hear him speak. He's pretty amazing.
Right on. Great.
What advice do you have for someone not working in climate today who wants to do something to help?
I'll take this, Kristen. The quick and dirty. This came from an SOSV partner. It is every company is a climate company. Every company in the whole world is operating in the world that we live in. In the company you're doing something. You're enacting some form of capitalism. You're making certain sort of decisions. Every company is a climate company. So you may not work for a climate tech company. You may not be specifically tackling one of the big, SDG driven goals out there in the world. But I sometimes get requests to meet with folks other people who are looking to change their careers or looking to aspiring to start something or want to end up leading something. And it's the most fun question that comes up. Well, what are you doing right now in your current company? And it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. So that's it. That's maybe a little bit off the cuff and maybe off topic, but that would be my quick answer to that. Like, you are working for a climate company. Do the most with that first, or evaluate. And if not, drop me a line. Happy to chat.
Nice. Okay. Zahlen, Kristen, thank you very much. That was really fun. Hardware to Save a Planet is brought to you by Synapse. To find out more about us and how we develop hardware solutions for the world's most ambitious companies, head to synapse.com. And then make sure to search for Hardware to Save a Planet in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you like to listen. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Synapse, thanks for listening.